For as bad of a year as 2020 was, one of the few not terrible things to come out of it was the reinvigorated interest in the early 2000s animated comedy Clone High. The show was about a bunch of secret government employees who dug up famous historical figures, cloned them, and sent them off to high school, as we followed the drama and shenanigans of characters like Abraham Lincoln, JFK, Joan of Arc, Cleopatra, and Gandhi, as the show used them to be satirical and make fun of other popular drama series around the same time. However, after massive backlash to the character of Gandhi's portrayal of the real historical figure, the show was soon cancelled, with the original creators Phil Lord and Chris Miller working to get it brought back ever since. Personally, I had never heard of Clone High before and never knew its existence until it started receiving a lot of popularity online during the pandemic, and after getting to watch the show for myself, I absolutely loved it. The show was smart, funny, witty, edgy, and animated well enough to compensate for the shoestring budget it had. It felt like something special, and something that could be greatly expanded upon. So with it ending in a way that left the door open for a continuation, plus Lord and Miller's interest in getting the show brought back, I was hopeful that something would come of all that. Luckily, 20 years later, the show finally got revitalized as a soft reboot/second season for streaming, which leads us to where we are now, with it finally being out and all episodes available. Unfortunately though, I can't say that it was entirely good and felt more like a letdown. The new Clone High reboot is probably one of the most disappointing follow-ups I have seen in some time. While I can't say that the new season is the worst adult comedy I've ever seen, especially to other ones that are also on the same streaming platform, I do think it's a step down from the original show in pretty much every way, and there's a multitude of reasons as to why it is in my eyes, and I think the best place to start with that is with the animation. Now, this may be a strange criticism to have against the show, since the animation is basically an improvement off of the original, especially since the team working on the reboot have a much bigger budget than the original show ever had, giving them the ability to do far more than the original show ever could do. But I feel as though that's kind of the issue. I don't believe that a bigger budget is a good thing. What I mean by that is that since the original show didn't have a ton of funding, it made it so that the animators and writers had to work around that roadblock and come up with jokes and workarounds to compensate. The jittery and somewhat stilted animation, in my opinion, played into the charm and identity of the original show. Moments where the animation was a little smoother than usual stood out way more since there were few moments like that. And since the animation was very quick, there could be small comedic bits thrown into every scene and made funny by how sudden they are. Here though, everything just seems too smooth, if that makes sense. There's really no humor that takes advantage of that kind of comedy the original had, and even when it attempts to, it falls on its face. Couple that with the backgrounds looking the exact same as before, with there being not a lot of detail in them, it makes everything then look just more jarring since certain things clash with each other, whether it be characters and their surroundings or characters entirely. It's like the animation team half-assed the whole show, without taking into consideration how it would all look in the final product. So because of that, everything now feels cheap. The only time the animation actually felt like an improvement without sacrificing the feeling of the original is with the second to last episode, where it utilizes different art styles, which was pretty cool to see, but unfortunately, that doesn't make up for the simple fact that the rest of the show didn't look as good. But what wasn't cool to see was how the reboot ruins nearly all of the characters here, both new and old. And I'm not just talking about being poorly written to where it's just a step down from the original's writing, I'm talking about how everyone here is so poorly written that the old characters feel like entirely different and worse people, and the new ones were written to be irritating and unlikable with no redeeming qualities. Starting with the OG cast, Abe went from being the oblivious and unsure of himself guy who means well to becoming a full-blown douchebag. The amount of shit Abe takes this season is insane. It's as if the writers completely missed the point of his character and turned him into something that he's not, then making it so that he's just getting dogpiled by everyone else all season long in the most contrived ways possible. It made no sense. Joan, instead of being the voice of reason, as she was before, is pretty selfish and out of character in this season, which is a running theme, unfortunately. Now, being one of the popular kids, she on multiple occasions abandons her oldest and closest friends in order to not be kicked out of the popular club, a position she really shouldn't care for since in the original she never cared for popularity and was fine with who she was. Plus, with her acting more like an unsure idiot and not how she did prior, makes this new version of her incredibly frustrating. JFK is no longer the charismatic womanizing jock who, although may not have been the brightest crayon in the coloring box, was a funny guy like in the original, but is now a husk of his former self with just the sex jokes remaining. The biggest issue with him here is the fact that he's overused. JFK in the original was never meant to be the main focus, leaving him to have the right amount of screen time. But here, the writers really couldn't think of anything new to do with him, leaving him to either be telling incredibly lame jokes or be an emotional mess without Joan, and whatever other new ideas there are with him are just bad.
I come from a long line of block-headed men. You see, my cranium is gigantic, allowing extra room for my brain to knock around in. In the heat of the desert, it expands like a popover, which allows it to grow to its full potential in my massive skull. It's science and it checks out.
What he said was really stupid.
That's just terrible writing.
On the surface, Cleo was just a typical attractive popular mean girl in the original, but was smart and able to use her beauty to get any guy to do what she wanted. She was socially ahead of the curve because she was secretly a manipulative genius, but apparently the writers just looked at her from a surface level and made her the most stereotypical mean girl possible. If you can think of a stereotype for that kind of character, Cleo has it. And since all the other characters have almost nothing to do with her now, Cleo causes conflict or is just mean for no reason because she's just the mean girl now. Plus, since she's no longer the popular girl in school, Cleo pretty much became irrelevant, which is made apparent since the writers barely give her any screen time throughout the season. And that certainly has to do a ton with the inclusion of the new cast of clones in their screen time, which is also where the character roster gets much worse. Frida is supposed to be a chill artistic skater who, although is supposed to be the most relaxed and understanding person in the new cast, immediately ruins that perception in episode 1 going along with cancel culture, thus making her character inconsistent right off the bat. While I totally didn't dislike her, Frida felt the most underdeveloped compared to the rest of the new clones, since there's a lot going on with her and other characters, but the writers didn't do enough with her to make anything that she's in feel natural in the slightest. Confucius is the personification of this clip.
How do you do, fellow kids?
I've never liked characters who are obsessed with social media and typically find them to be some of the most irritating types of characters, and Confucius is one of the worst. He acts like what a 60-year-old executive thinks Gen X kids are like, and he never improves as the season goes on. Really, I just feel blessed every time his mouth doesn't open, but then immediately become depressed when it does. Harriet is a friendly theater kid, and that's it. She honest to God has no notable traits besides those. No major flaws, other interests, nothing. So when the writers try to put her together with Confucius, the relationship turns out to be just like her character, underdeveloped and misplaced. The only other new character that I don't actually hate here is Topher Bus, who is actually a clone of Christopher Columbus, but is trying to distance himself from his clone dad. He's the only new clone who actually fits in the setting, who has any trace of the cynicism that built up the original show. He's basically an incel who wants to be seen as a good person, understanding and supporting social issues, when in actuality, he is a terrible person, and in turn, a perfect fit for Clone High. But unfortunately, after episode 2, he's barely in the show and is almost never utilized throughout it, making him just wasted potential by the end of the whole thing. But beyond their personalities not fitting into Clone High and being terribly handled, the new clone designs are awful. They're way too over-designed and have too many colors that are also way too bright. Like, it really isn't hard to tell which ones are season 1 characters and which ones are not. It gets even worse when you can't even tell who some of them are supposed to be. What visual characteristics or behaviors would lead you to believe that this is a clone of American abolitionist Harriet Tubman, or this is Chinese philosopher Confucius? Literally, the only two clones that fit in are Frida on account for her being a creative artist who doesn't belong to this world, which makes the patterns and colors make sense with her, and Topher, who legit looks like a character who could have been in the original, for how simple his color scheme is and not being over-designed. But it's more strange how the new main cast of clones stand out like sore thumbs, yet most of the background clones don't look too out of place and fit right in. That pretty much goes to show you that the designers didn't give a damn about visual cohesion, where some clones look perfectly normal and others look like they have an obnoxious color scheme of cotton candy. And speaking of things that are obnoxious, the jokes of the season were extremely unfunny, which to me is really disappointing, since the comedy was one of the best parts of the original. And when I say bad comedy, I mean we get literal fart jokes and violence for the sake of it levels of bad comedy. The original show may have used violence for comedy, but the difference there was that it was used sparingly, so it made those handful of moments more shocking, on top of the violent acts themselves not being the punchline for the jokes. A moment like Gandhi reacting to a living creature having an actual zipper be a part of its body and then lead to an entirely different and funny joke is 10 times funnier than watching Cleopatra mutilate herself and that be the joke. Additionally, there's multiple moments where characters break the fourth wall, looking directly into the camera, making it seem as though the show is smart and knows what's going on, but in actuality is incredibly annoying and goes to show that the writers thought that what they made was really intelligent, but then they lost any chance of them looking intelligent when they made an unfunny fart joke in the first episode. It really says a lot about how unfunny this show is when stupid little moments like this
Be the most powerful force in the universe.
Ooh, gimme!
The inscription warns that the crown is deadly in the wrong hands and must only be worn by nobility.
Fucking bullshit.
made me chuckle compared to the actual jokes. It's not even that the rest of the humor is bad, but it's also just lazy. In episode 5, about half of all of the jokes are about white guys, and they went for the lowest hanging fruit possible with that.
Vegas, baby!
Golden parachute! Storming the Capitol!
Golf!
The writers really didn't think of anything clever to do with stereotypical white guy jokes, and like those white guy jokes, whenever an episode has a certain theme going on, any humor relating to it gets old extremely fast. Other times, characters just say things that I think are supposed to be jokes, but then don't really have a punchline, leaving those moments to feel awkward and unfitting. And like I mentioned before, with the animation not taking advantage of the visual gags like in the original, it leaves the reboot needing to have well-written jokes to carry the comedy. And just like everything else here, it fails miserably at providing anything new and good. Though one of my biggest complaints with this season is the fact that it just feels so disconnected from the original beyond art style and writing. So many things from the original go unmentioned or underutilized. There's only like 2 background clones from the original who interact with the main cast or actually talk. It really makes the environment feel lifeless. This is supposed to be a school where students interact with each other, yet it doesn't seem as though anyone is actually interacting with each other. Locations beyond the school are barely utilized and are actually destroyed. We only get to see one of the new clones' foster parents, and we never actually learn what happened to the original ones, besides a throwaway line for one of them. And ironically enough, even though this new show is more story and character driven than the original, it certainly didn't care enough to explain missing characters and elements from the first. Like I mentioned with the foster parents, we don't get a single mention of the rival schools or anything. The original board of shadowy figures was frozen with everyone else, and the fact that they didn't show back up again, or at the very least were mentioned, makes no sense. How funny would it have been to see those guys butt heads with the new council? The comedy there could have been endless. But after going through this whole season, I realized that the biggest reason as to why this whole thing just felt off and nothing like what Clone High was, is because the new writers didn't understand the original. The original was never meant to be an actual teen drama with 3-dimensional characters. It was a satirization of teen dramas of its time, poking fun at many of the cliches of those shows, being written incredibly well to be clever in the parody angle and funny in the comedy angle, with blink and you'll miss it type jokes and subtle jabs at other shows, while also utilizing the historical relevance the show had with the characters literally being historical figures. The characters were never meant to be relatable. They were tools of the writers to, again, tell jokes and poke fun at other drama series. But at the same time, they all equally contributed to the show as a whole. So when the reboot tries to legitimately get you to care about the relationships in it and create new ones that have no build-up and feel insanely forced, it becomes laughable. The reboot doesn't even use the fact that the characters are historical figures to its advantage. The most simple thing that made the original stand out was that it was a high school setting with famous people from history, and the new show doesn't even utilize that. Oh my god. And since the reboot puts a lot of focus on the drama angle and not the satirical one, it doesn't utilize all of its characters well, like Principal Scudworth and Mr. B. 2 characters who get sidelined pretty hard and made somewhat worse with the inclusion of the new character Candide Simpson, a character who is actually a decent inclusion to the show, but overall negatively impacts the dynamic of characters like Scudworth and Mr. B. I think the writers realized this, since the second to last episode is entirely based on those 2 and is hands down the best episode of this season, both writing and animation wise. But unfortunately, that doesn't really mean much when all the other episodes range from mediocre to bad. The Clone High reboot literally became the very thing the original was making fun of, and that would be more funny if this wasn't the actual continuation of the show. Honestly, out of all the episodes, I can only say that about 4 or 5 were average at best, which out of a 10 episode long season is downright bad. It's not that the other episodes were the worst thing to be put on television or anything, it was more about how they lost what made the original show so good all of those years ago. Really, it just makes this show seem incredibly disappointing and mediocre, falling into similar tropes other shows have done while trying to parade itself as if it's smarter than it really is. It's a shadow of its former self, and if I knew that this is what the 20-year-long wait would bring us, I honestly would have wanted Clone High to have been left buried than turned into this. So, without anything else to add, I give the Clone High reboot a 4 out of 10.